In 1940, the German army was moving so fast across France that their own field maps were often obsolete by the time the ink dried.
They had deliberately broken their communications, bypassed key defensive points, and yet they achieved the most coordinated, sweeping victory in modern history.
The secret was not merely the tank, the aircraft, or the audacity of the generals. It was the doctrine that taught a corporal to think like a field marshal.
The fundamental shift began with a concept deeply rooted in Prussian military tradition, formalized into what we know as Auftragstaktik, or mission-based command. This was the decentralized engine that powered the Blitzkrieg.
Instead of handing down micromanaged, step-by-step instructions detailing exactly when and how a position should be taken, German High Command gave their subordinates one thing: a clear, overriding objective, known as the opposite intent.
The crucial part was the trust placed in the officer on the ground to figure out the how. This system represented a profound cultural and operational departure from the rigid command structures of the First World War.
For a German major leading a motorized battalion, this meant that if a critical bridge was discovered intact hours ahead of schedule, he didn't wait for a 3-hour radio chain to approve the crossing. He acted immediately, knowing that his promotion or even his professional survival depended not on strict obedience, but on demonstrating initiative and exploiting the sudden, fleeting opportunities of battle. The command culture demanded aggression and decisiveness, even at the risk of making a tactical error. The real impact of Auftragstaktik became tangible during the 1940 invasion. German armored spearheads, sometimes composed of just a handful of panzers and accompanying motorized infantry, frequently outran their own radio communications. The command system was designed to function in this very vacuum. Junior officers were trained, from the military academies onward, to interpret the broader strategic intent, to advance and cause systemic collapse, and make rapid decisions in isolation. This mindset allowed Panzer Divisions to seize essential river crossings and infrastructure hours before the highest headquarters even realized the crossing had become feasible, effectively accelerating the operational timetable beyond Allied comprehension.
This reliance on shared understanding over perfect coordination meant that even when radio contact broke down entirely, which happened often in the chaos of Poland and France, units continued to move, and crucially, they continued to move in the correct operational direction, guided by the overarching objective. However, the system was inherently fragile. Auftragstaktik demanded highly trained, experienced, and confident leaders at every level, from company commander to corps general. As the war transitioned from short, lightning campaigns into the protracted, grinding attrition of the Eastern Front, the casualty rates among these elite, highly trained officers skyrocketed. By 1944, while the doctrine's name was still invoked, many German units simply lacked the trained leadership capital to execute it effectively. Initiative, without the requisite tactical skill and understanding of higher intent, slowly devolved into dangerous improvisation, particularly as resources dried up. What once created unparalleled speed and flexibility became a liability when units were forced to fight without resources or coherent support. Hand in hand with decentralized command was the principle of concentration of force, Schwertprinzip. At the heart of German battlefield success lay the deceptively simple yet utterly ruthless idea of choosing where to be overwhelmingly strong. While other armies attempted to maintain strength across their entire front, the German High Command was willing to accept calculated risk, sometimes leaving entire sectors lightly defended, in order to achieve decisive, overwhelming superiority at one chosen point, the Schwerpunkt. The Schwerpunkt was not an arbitrary location. It was the point on the enemy front where a breakthrough would yield the greatest collapse, often targeting seams between armies, boundaries between operational zones, or areas the enemy believed to be impassable. Once the point was selected, armor, mechanized infantry, artillery, engineers, and close air support were concentrated there, often achieving local numerical superiority of 5-to-1 or 7-to-1 in key assets, even when the Germans were outnumbered strategically overall. The defining example of this execution occurred in May 1940. The Allies had confidently reinforced Belgium and the North, believing the dense, supposedly tank-proof,
forests of the Ardennes to be a safe flank. The Germans chose this very spot as their Schwerpunkt. At the critical crossing point on the Meuse near Sedan, the concentrated panzer forces, utilizing the narrow focus, achieved the necessary breakthrough ratio.
This blow was not just physical, it was a profound psychological shock.
Once the rupture occurred, enemy commanders often reacted too slowly, fixating on secondary sectors or attempting to counterattack the initial breach with piecemeal reserves, failing to grasp that the German goal was not to occupy the crossing, but to race into the unfortified rear. The French front fractured not because it was equally weak everywhere, but because it was absolutely shattered at one critical scene. The power of the Schwerpunkt demanded precise reconnaissance and strategic judgment. Misidentifying the enemy's weak point, or worse, achieving the breakthrough and failing to immediately exploit it, would waste elite units and expose the fragile flanks created by the original concentration of force. As the war dragged on, especially against the deep, resilient defenses of the Soviets from 1943 onward, achieving this devastating concentration became increasingly costly and difficult to mask. The principle remained sound, but the conditions required to make it devastating, logistical abundance and air superiority, vanished. The mechanism by which the Schwerpunkt was exploited was Bewegungskrieg, or mobile warfare. This doctrine asserted that movement was not merely a phase between battles, it was the combat itself. The core philosophy was to never allow the battlefield to become static, for once the front stabilized, the advantages of initiative, decision speed, and maneuver dissolved.
In practice, Bewegungskrieg meant continuous, often reckless pressure. German armored formations were explicitly directed to avoid prolonged, costly firefights over minor strongpoints.
Instead, they were to push forward immediately after a breach, even if it meant their flanks were exposed or their supply lines were running critically thin. The goal was to maintain momentum and keep the enemy in a permanent state of reaction, denying them the crucial 24 to 48 hours needed to regroup, establish coherent defenses, or bring up reserves. Operation Barbarossa in 1941 provided the definitive, terrifying display of this. Panzer groups raced hundreds of kilometers in the opening weeks. They bypassed fortified cities and strong Soviet defensive lines, leaving them for the follow-up infantry divisions. Soviet units frequently found themselves encircled or cut off, not because they were defeated head-on, but because the entire operational front had shifted faster than their centralized, rail-dependent command structure could possibly adapt. A critical, often underestimated detail was the calculated logistical risk. German supply columns were organized to follow the rapidly moving spearheads, often operating at the very edge of sustainability. Commanders accepted temporary fuel shortages, mechanical attrition, and extreme fatigue as a necessary price, believing that operational momentum, the systemic collapse of the enemy's will and command, was a greater asset than having perfectly stocked fuel dumps. In the short term, this gamble was devastatingly effective, resulting in the collapse of entire Soviet armies before the German fuel gauge hit zero. Yet, this high-stakes approach carried inherent vulnerabilities. Continuous movement exhausted both men and machines. When the initial shock was absorbed, and particularly when the vast distances and terrain of the Eastern Front proved too taxing, the same mobility that enabled the rapid advances ensured that when the movement finally stopped, the German forces were thinly stretched and lacked the depth to sustain a prolonged war of attrition. Once the breach was achieved at the Schwerpunkt, German doctrine demanded extreme speed and aggression during the exploitation phase. Armored and motorized units were explicitly ordered to pour through the gap without any hesitation, leaving the slower, unmotorized infantry to secure the flanks and the captured ground later. The objective was not to fight the front line. It was to drive deep into the enemy's rear areas and destroy the structural integrity of the opposing army. This meant targeting command posts, signal centers, massive supply depots, rail junctions, and key bridges, the nervous system and arteries of the operational army. The 1940 campaign provides a chilling metric of success. After the initial Meuse crossing at Sedan, German panzer divisions did not pause to fortify their bridgeheads. Instead, they advanced westwards with astonishing velocity, covering distances exceeding 300 kilometers in less than 2 weeks. French reserves, often slow-moving and still operating under outdated intelligence, suddenly found their expected route to the front blocked, their communication lines severed, and their forward fuel and ammunition stocks captured or destroyed. Entire formations, still intact on paper, became combat ineffective simply because the infrastructure required to put men into combat, fuel, radio orders, and logistics, had been vaporized by forces operating far behind them. The exploitation led to systemic collapse, where enemy units remained physically present but ceased to function as a coordinated force. The battle was won not by a physical destruction at the front, but by a paralysis in the rear.
The logical culmination of this exploitation was Kesselschlacht, the Cauldron Battle, or encirclement and annihilation. The ultimate German operational goal was not merely to push the enemy back, but to destroy entire armies as viable fighting forces.
Kesselschlacht achieved this by combining the initial breakthrough, rapid exploitation, and perfectly coordinated flanking movements to seal enemy forces inside a pocket.
Once surrounded, the trapped forces were instantly cut off from command, resupply, and reinforcement. German doctrine viewed an encircled army not as a tactical problem, but as a self-solving operational one. Time, hunger, exhaustion, and confusion would finish the job without the need for high-casualty frontal assaults. The sheer scale of these operations in 1941 was unprecedented. At Kiev, one of the largest encirclements in military history, approximately 600,000 Soviet troops were captured or destroyed. This victory was achieved not through continuous frontal engagement, but through maneuver that collapsed the Soviet operational and logistical system entirely. Crucially, Kesselschlacht relied on two distinct rings: the fast-moving outer ring, formed by the mobile panzer units, which had to close the pocket quickly, and the slower, heavier inner ring, typically infantry divisions, which followed to compress and tighten the pocket, neutralizing any attempted breakout.
Any delay in closing the outer ring risked allowing large enemy formations to slip away or launch a costly counter-breakout. Psychologically, encirclement was devastating.
Units inside the pocket quickly descended into chaos as fuel and ammunition shortages spread panic, often leading to the surrender of formations that had barely exhausted their combat capacity.
However, like all offensive German tactics, the ability to execute large-scale Kesselschlacht depended entirely on maintaining superior mobility and manpower, both of which evaporated by 1943, forcing the Germans into new, desperate adaptations.
One of the most immediate and defining force multipliers of the early campaigns was the seamless integration of air power into ground operations, a process known as close air support integration. For the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe was not merely an independent strategic arm. Its primary role was as flying artillery, tools designed to shape the battlefield directly in front of the advancing troops. Unlike the Allied approach, which often prioritized long-range strategic bombing, the Luftwaffe focused intensely on immediate tactical effects. The dreaded Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, equipped with the infamous Jericho trumpet siren, was often assigned directly to specific ground units, responding to requests channeled from forward commanders, rather than operating from rigid pre-planned target lists. This permitted German commanders to apply air power with surgical precision where resistance was strongest or where offensive momentum risked stalling. The psychological impact was arguably as important as the physical destruction. Stuka attacks were precisely timed to coincide with the opening moments of a ground assault, creating an impression of overwhelming, inescapable force. During the 1940 campaign, concentrated dive bombing against prepared defensive positions and river crossings frequently caused Allied units to abandon their posts prematurely, even before German infantry closed in.
Cohesion often collapsed under the simultaneous pressure from air and ground, resulting in the rapid disintegration of defenses where actual casualties from the bombs were surprisingly light.
The key technical detail was communication. German forward air controllers operated near the front lines, often alongside artillery spotters, utilizing dedicated radio channels to direct strikes in near real time.
This level of responsiveness was revolutionary for the era, allowing German formations to suppress enemy artillery, break forming counterattacks, or seal a breach within minutes of identifying the threat.
However, this tactic relied fundamentally on two precarious conditions: air superiority and favorable flying weather. As Allied fighter strength surged and anti-aircraft defenses improved after 1942, the Luftwaffe's ability to provide reliable, localized support drastically declined, robbing the German ground forces of a key advantage that had defined their early invincibility. While the early German offensives are visually remembered for sweeping tank maneuvers, one of their most effective and destabilizing methods relied on something far quieter: infiltration and disruption. This tactic was aimed not at destroying every enemy position head-on, but at paralyzing the enemy's ability to fight cohesively by attacking its internal structures.
Infiltration meant bypassing strong points entirely. Small, highly trained German assault teams, often composed of specialized engineers, Pioniere, and light infantry, would slip through weak sectors, gaps between units, dense forests, or during the cover of darkness. Their primary targets were never the frontline troops. They aimed for command posts, vital signal centers, field hospitals, and logistical choke points like road junctions. The effect was often entirely disproportionate to the forces involved. During the initial months of Operation Barbarossa, relatively small German Spezialkommandos penetrated deep into the Soviet rear, severing main communication cables and capturing headquarters staff, generating confusion far greater than their limited numbers suggested. Soviet divisions sometimes continued to fight for hours, unaware that their command structure had already been neutralized. The real trick was the speed of contagion. Once primary communication lines failed, enemy commanders were forced to rely on outdated orders or localized improvisation. Counterattacks would be launched directionless. Reserves moved to the wrong location. Frontline troops hesitated, unsure whether they were advancing into an unsecured flank or walking into a trap. German planners grasped a crucial truth: confusion multiplies exponentially faster than casualties. This tactic worked synergistically with the doctrine of speed, as the rear areas of rapidly retreating or disorganized armies were always the most lightly defended. A small unit appearing unexpectedly behind the main force could trigger panic and the perception of encirclement, which often mattered more than the actual military reality. Like its offensive counterparts, infiltration demanded highly trained, flexible, and mobile troops. As German resources dwindled and the sheer volume of Allied troops increased, opportunities for deep penetration declined, severely limiting its effectiveness in the latter half of the war. As the strategic balance irrevocably shifted against Germany, particularly after the catastrophic losses at Stalingrad and Kursk, the focus shifted from winning decisively to surviving effectively. The army increasingly relied on a sophisticated defensive method designed to trade precious space for critically needed time: the elastische Verteidigung, or elastic defense. This was the complete rejection of rigid positional warfare, which the Germans had seen fail catastrophically in the trenches of World War I. Elastic defense aimed to absorb the momentum of an overwhelming enemy attack, disrupt its synchronization, and then strike back at the attacker's most vulnerable moment. The core idea was a controlled operational withdrawal. Forward positions were lightly manned, serving primarily to delay the attacker, inflict initial casualties, and canalize the main attack into specific killing zones rather than stopping it outright. As enemy forces advanced, their units became stretched, disorganized, and exposed to pre-sighted artillery and pre-planned counterattacks. German reserves, typically highly mobile armored formations held back precisely for this purpose, were then committed not to hold the line, but to inflict maximum damage against the enemy's exposed flanks before performing a controlled disengagement and preparing for the next line of defense. This strategy was perfected by commanders like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein on the Eastern Front in 1943. Following the massive, resource-draining Battle of Kursk, Manstein used elastic defense to blunt numerically superior Soviet offensives. Soviet units would advance into what appeared to be weak resistance, only to be met by devastatingly coordinated artillery barrages
and swift, mobile counterattacks against their operational flanks. In many instances, Soviet formations suffered immense losses after achieving initial territorial gains, illustrating the true purpose: not to hold ground, but to make every step forward fiscally and physically unsustainable for the attacker.
The success of elastic defense hinged entirely on disciplined coordination and perfect timing. Retreating too early meant ceding vital terrain too easily. Retreating too late risked a catastrophic encirclement.
German units were uniquely trained to disengage under heavy pressure, a complex skill that few armies could master. However, the requirement for mobility and highly experienced troops remained the fatal flaw.
As Germany lost its veteran personnel, its remaining tanks, and, most critically, the fuel required to keep those reserves mobile, the tactic became increasingly difficult to execute. By late 1944, resource scarcity often forced units into static positions, undermining the very flexibility that made the defense viable.
Finally, in the desperate twilight stages of the war, when Germany could no longer afford the counterattacks required by elastic defense, they transitioned to the pure attrition model, defense in depth. Rejecting the concept of holding a single, continuous front line, German commanders organized multiple, interlocking defensive layers stretching many kilometers behind the nominal front.
The forwardmost line was deliberately weak, often functioning as a tripwire to absorb the initial shock and definitively identify the enemy's main axis of attack.
Behind this layer lay stronger positions, complex networks of trenches, interlocking fields of fire, deep artillery zones, and specialized anti-tank defenses, ready to engage the attacker only once they were fully committed, stretched thin, and disorganized. This layered system was vital on all fronts from 1944 onwards. Allied and Soviet offensives often achieved rapid initial gains, penetrating the forward screening elements within hours. But as they advanced, resistance intensified sharply.
Tanks moved into meticulously pre-sighted kill zones. Infantry faced overlapping machine gun fire from hardened positions. And crucially, the attacker supply line stretched, coming under constant pressure from German counter-battery fire and deep infiltration units. In many cases, the enemy suffered their heaviest casualties after the initial breakthrough, trapped inside the German defensive network. The central aim of defense in depth was to buy time and inflict maximum attrition, not to hold territory at all costs.
German planners knew they could not halt massive mechanized offensives outright, but they could slow them down, bleed them profusely, and force the enemy to conduct repeated, time-consuming regrouping operations.
Every hour gained on the front translated into days for higher command to reposition dwindling reserves or prepare the next defensive line.
Yet this system demanded immense resources, manpower to staff multiple defensive belts, an endless supply of artillery ammunition to sustain prolonged fighting, and the engineers required to construct the interlocking positions. By 1945, many of these depth defenses existed primarily on military maps, not in reality, as German resources had been utterly exhausted. Defense in depth represents the final evolution of German military doctrine in the face of overwhelming material superiority, a strategy focused solely on preventing immediate collapse and maximizing the cost of victory for the enemy.
If this deep analysis of the doctrines that powered and eventually burdened the German military machine helped you understand the mechanics of the war more clearly, then stay tuned. Next time, we pivot the analysis entirely to dissect the tactical responses of the Allied forces, specifically how the Soviet Union adapted its strategy after 1941 to neutralize the Blitzkrieg doctrines and turn the tide against these very methods. You won't want to miss the analysis of deep battle doctrine and the secrets behind the Red Army's staggering capacity for operational resilience.